Eli MacLaren teaches Canadian literature and the history of the book in the Department of English at McGill University. He's the author of Dominion and Agency, Copyright and the Structuring of the Canadian Book Trade, 1867 to 1918, University of Toronto Press, 2011, and has forthcoming articles on fair dealing, Al Purdy, John Lovell, and Sarah Jeanette Duncan. From 2012 to 2017, he was the editor of the Papers of the Bibliographical Society of Canada, and in 2015, he co-organized the annual conference for the Society for the History of Authorship, Reading, and Publishing, SHARP, in Montreal. And today we're going to talk about the Ryerson Press's series of Chap-Books that you've been doing some studies on. Welcome to the Bibliophile.
Thank you very much.
So what's the name of that paper that you wrote?
The one published in Canadian Poetry?
Yeah.
Significant Little Offerings at the Origin of the Ryerson Poetry Chap-Books.
1925 and 1926.
Yeah, that's right. Looking at the first 2 years of the series.
So to start off with, the kind of literary publishing environment at that time was stifling in Canada.
Yeah, exactly. It was, I argue it was essentially a system of publisher agents. Canadian booksellers had learned how to work with British and American publishers, and they had learned how to produce textbooks for Canada. So much of the publishing focused there on importing and wholesaling books, mostly from the States, and distributing them to the Canadian market and publishing textbooks. So the question is, can that firm, which is a sort of publisher, can that firm produce original literature? Can it become a specialist literary publisher or not? And what fascinates me about Lorne Pierce is that
Lorne Pierce was the book editor at
the Ryerson Press, which was, of course, the trade name of the Methodist Book and Publishing House, which went back into the 19th century, back to the 1830s. Lorne Pierce wanted to be a Canadian publisher.
Not an agent.
No, not just an agent. I mean, Ryerson did that. They made a lot of money that way, helped them build their building down on King Street in Toronto.
And just to clarify, being an agent meant basically you just resold American and British publications into the Canadian market?
Yes.
Did you put your imprint on it?
Sometimes.
Yeah.
You could just import the book. You could publish an issue of the book. But what you weren't doing was publishing original editions, in the strict sense of working with an author to create the first edition of a book, setting the type and designing it, doing all that.
You weren't taking any risks.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So risk is kind of the key concept, I think. And I think it remains the key idea in what a publisher is. And I guess what interests me is that, there was nationalism. There was a huge desire for a national literature many times over, going back and back and back through Canadian history. So that wasn't the problem. And I don't think the problem was that was a lack of a critical mass of readers. People have argued that. But we had cities in Canada, large enough to support a book trade from the late 18th century on. So I don't think that was the problem. Despite the French-English divide and all that, I don't think that was the problem. I really think the problem was structural and legal, that copyright laws got in the way.
So to explain that then.
Yeah, sure. Okay, well, it's kind of complicated, but I mean, the simplest factor is that the United States had a very protectionist system. You had to print your book in the United States to get copyright in the United States. And the Americans did this deliberately and consciously in order to protect and encourage their industry.
Kind of like Donald Trump and Steele.
I guess so, yeah. Yeah. And that was great for Americans, but bad for Canada, or bad for Canadian publishers, at least. So Pierce came along and...
But then, just to finish that,
yeah.
The British had... What role did they... Because they squeezed from the other side.
They did, yes. They were pushing basically international copyright. They were pushing first imperial copyright, and then after the signing of the Berne Convention in 1886, they were pushing international copyright.
For their own...
Well, they were pushing the high principle of copyright, which is that, basically an author publishing a book anywhere should have worldwide rights to control its publication.
But they controlled copyright in Canada, though.
They did, yeah, and they made sure that Canada towed the line. They made sure that Canada respected, first of all, imperial and then international European Berne Convention copyright.
So what does that mean?
Well, it meant that someone setting up as a publisher in Toronto couldn't reprint Dickens. Whereas if you went 100 miles south, into New York State, then you could reprint Dickens. So you could, American firms could print Dickens for 5-10 cents retail price, and Canadian firms couldn't.
So it's a great moneymaker that they were losing out on.
It was, and I think we need to understand publishing as a kind of basket of activities. You might have a successful textbook line, you might have a successful reprint series, and then you might do some original publishing. And original publishing sort of needs that diversity in order to be stable, because every book is a risk. It might take off, it might fail.
So did they not take any risks on Canadian authors then?
Canadian firms?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think generally they try to avoid investing their own money on new Canadian authors. Yeah, absolutely. And that shows how that's bad for literature, because authors do need support to be nurtured and developed,
And so the good ones or the ambitious ones went to the States.
Yeah, that's right. I think of someone like Charles G Dee Roberts, who was an ardent nationalist. He did his best to be a writer in Canada.
He's a Confederation poet.
He was a Confederation poet, yeah. And eventually he threw in the towel and went to New York to write animal stories and made money doing that.
So he lived in the States,
Mm-hmm.
right, and made money there, but then he came back to Canada, right?
He went to Europe for a while, served in the First World War, came back to Canada in 1925. Is that right? 1924. And that was the occasion Lorne Pierce seized to launch his Ryerson Poetry Chap-Books.
He said, give me some of your stuff and we'll put it into this. There's the first one.
Yeah, precisely. Yeah.
Even though it wasn't original. Or
right.
was it?
No, it wasn't. It was essentially reprinting what Roberts' poetry they could get their hands on.
Without incurring legal problems.
Yeah, and there are threatening letters from the Boston publisher L.C. Page to Lorne Pierce in the Queen's Archive at Queen's University.
Was he the one that was such an asshole to Lucy Maud Montgomery?
Yeah,
Okay.
precisely, yeah. She dragged him through the courts over, I forget the details for which book exactly, but yeah, he was a fiend for a number of Canadian authors, because he was just so strict, I guess, with his contracts and his copyrights.
He said basically you can't publish with a Canadian because I've got the rights to Canada?
Yeah, he did. And I think that's maybe, returning to the copyright question, that's sort of the key idea, that the Americans saw Canada as part of a North American market that they controlled. And Britain saw Canada as a colony that they controlled. Mm-hmm. So there were these overlapping...
Kind of the bête noire of being Canadian.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Stuck in the triangle.
Okay.
But about Pierce launching his series, I think it's important to back up and see what he was doing just before he launched the Ryerson Poetry Chap-Books. And what he was doing just before was a series called Makers of Canadian Literature. Essentially, this was an initiative to try to give Canada a literature.
What does that mean, give Canada a literature? If is he including things that they've written in these? Is it like an anthology, or is it just a biography?
It was a mixed genre of biographical sketch, anthology, and I think an appreciation, critical appreciation by someone. There are a few different components of these books. Mm-hmm. And what matters is that Lorne Pierce did it on a big scale. He commissioned the most important people he could find to write on Canada's most important writers. For example, he commissioned Duncan Campbell Scott to write a book on Archibald Lampman. He paid them very big advances for the time, hundreds of dollars. And this all before a single copy of the book sold. Right. So he invested heavily in this series, and it collapsed under its own weight. And
he was in conflict with his boss, whoever
it was Samuel Follis, the book steward.
Okay.
So he regrouped after this defeat and thought, how can I publish Canadian literature? And
on the cheap.
On the cheap. Yeah. Right. And the Chap-Books was the answer that he hit upon. I mean, it's not the only thing he published. He did also publish full-length books. He published Frederick Philip Grove, Settlers of the Marsh, and later on he published books by Earl Burney, B.K. Page. So the Chap-Books weren't the only thing going, but they were an interesting example of, well, what I think we're looking at essentially is pioneering of the small press inside an old publisher agent. He found a way to publish literature cheaply and roped in the authors for covering the risk. The authors had to provide a guarantee that they would compensate Ryerson in the case of loss.
So did they have? Sometimes they paid up front. Sometimes they guaranteed that if it didn't sell, they would cover the cost.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I think in this case, mostly the latter, most of the guarantees, and I don't really know how much money changed hands. It might have been a protective thing for Lorne Pierce's sake, in reporting to a supervisor. But there are letters from authors saying, I guarantee to cover in the amount of maximum $100 if my book doesn't sell.
And how much was $100 in today's money?
Oh, that's a good question. It's hard to estimate exactly. I mean, at least 10 times that. So, it was sizable.
Okay. I read, I'm not sure if it was in your piece or somewhere else, that he didn't just go after the best authors he could find. He wanted to give anyone a shot. But he would be the determining the factor. I mean, his editorial eye would be what counted, right?
Right. Yeah, that's an important point. He was interested in representing the nation. He was interested in voices from all across the country. In the Chap-Book series, we have poets from the West Coast, from Vancouver Island, from BC, Alberta, across the prairies, Ontario, Quebec, the Maritimes. So he was interested in that representative impulse in Canadian literature, to try to really gather the voices of the country. He himself had been, what's the correct term, a probationer on the prairies, not a missionary exactly, but kind of a priest.
Teacher, wasn't he?
Minister in training. Well, a minister. I mean, he was ordained a Methodist minister. So yeah, he taught. The anecdote I recall from Sandra Campbell's biography is that he, had to help immigrants bury their dead, on the frozen prairie. It was a pretty agonizing process. So his heart went out to Canadians across the country, and he wanted to help them find their voice, I guess. So that was one important aspect of the series. On the other hand, the other important aspect is that Charles G. Dee Roberts quickly asserted his aesthetic taste over the series.
Again, according to your article, he did more than that. He got his niece in there, he got his brother, he got his lover, girlfriend. I mean, when I read that, I thought, Pierce is putting up with this?
Yeah. Well, Pierce was a polite man. I mean, he wrote in his diary that he was disappointed and appalled by Roberts's morals. But at the same time...
But what about him accepting this? He didn't have to accept this.
No, it's true. I guess he believed that Charles G. Dee Roberts, and this is true, had done something very important for Canadian poetry in the 1880s. He was sort of the leader, mentor of the first real school of English Canadian poets, Confederation poets. And
so this is payback, or?
Yeah, I think it's acknowledgement, acknowledgement. And I suppose we would react differently today, but at the time, the unsavory details of Robert's life were swept under the carpet, and his good work for literature was celebrated. So I think that's what was happening. Also, he was a powerful personality.
Well, so was Pierce, though, no?
So was Pierce. Yeah, so was Pierce. I mean, he's still very much Roberts' junior in 1925.
Oh, okay.
So I think he probably deferred to him.
Right.
But yeah, so I mean, the Chap-Books as a series did come to stand for a certain kind of middle-brow or even backward-looking romantic Victorian poetry as opposed to a modernist poetry.
Yeah, before we get to that, I just want to, there was a passage in, I just want to read this out quickly because it talks to what you were saying about Pierce sort of wanting to nation build with this.
Yeah.
And give a voice to the regional parts of the country.
Right.
Okay, so here we are. And this is Pierce writing in after the fact, and he wrote a little pamphlet called On Publishers and Publishing, published by the Ryerson Press in 1951. And in here he says, best of all, he's talking about publishers, they have shown great pride in their lands, their own lands, whether proud kingdom or humble city-state, and they have urged artists and writers unceasingly to paint and sing and write of what they saw, of the life crowding about them. They have implored these creative spirits to give some true hint of the wealth hidden in their native soil, to explain their own people to themselves and be their spokesman to the world. Every nation that has ever reached maturity has had these master builders working for it, and not infrequently these have been the real first ministers of the realm. Mm-hmm. You're talking about himself.
Yes. Yeah, well, I mean, I think what's fascinating about Lorne Pierce is what a stalwart idealist he was, you know, and I've grown increasingly to respect that, because he just wouldn't give up. You know, he wouldn't give up. He stayed in his editorial saddle for almost 40 years, you know, and he was devoted to those ideals. So on the one hand, I really respect the sentiment he's expressing there. On the other hand, we also need more scholarly, critical accounts of what was going on, you know, because it's more complicated than just making heroes, you know. Going
on with who?
Just happening in Canadian publishing. Mm-hmm. You know, there were lots of...
So he was idealistic.
He was idealistic, yes.
But others may not have been.
Well, he might not have been able to achieve as much as he hoped, always.
Right. Well, that's the point you make about these chapbooks, is that they're just sort of, they've disappeared. No one's paying much attention to them.
Yeah, that is often the case. You know, a number of chapbooks I've purchased or found in libraries aren't even opened.
I've got a couple. I think I mentioned to you when I saw you first.
Yes.
And I think I got them at McLeod's bookstore in Vancouver.
Okay.
In the basement.
Uh-huh.
So that's a good spot to head to. At least I think the last time I was there, I think there were quite a few of them.
Okay. Thanks.
But they're pristine.
Yes. Right.
It's like they were just printed last week.
Yeah. Yeah, they're not particularly rare books, most of them.
Yeah.
There's a few exceptions.
Well, there's only 250 of each, though. That's pretty rare.
Right, yes.
And they get beat up, too, so...
Yeah, but I mean, many libraries in the country have these chapbooks, and you can find a lot of them online.
Were they made in hardcover?
No.
None of them?
No. The physical format of the chapbooks is interesting. I think the term is saddle-stitched. But really it's just a staple, you know, in the gutter. There's no proper title page. The front and back covers are paper, a heavy paper with a color. And they have until a certain date, a woodcut designed by a group of 7-member J.E.H. MacDonald, and then touched up by his son, Thoreau MacDonald, on the front. So they all look the same in that regard.
Yeah, it's a very kind of arts and crafts look to it, isn't it?
It is.
When you think of it, though, arts and craft was 1890s.
Right.
This was so it's not a modern look.
No.
At all.
No.
It's not avant-garde.
No, it's not. And in that sense, it corresponds with the Poetics, which also wasn't modernist and...
Exactly. Yeah. You talk about provincial flowers, pine trees, and a lyre, symbolizing the power of poetry to create a nation.
Uh-huh. Yes. Yeah, that's where he was at. Now, some of the books in the series have become rather important, like Anne Marriott's The Wind Our Enemy has been taken up and anthologized, and it's really part of the canon, and it's read as a modernist poem.
When was that published?
That was 1939.
Yeah, I think again that's what I think where you were headed with this.
Mm-hmm.
It starts off with a sort of a late romantic
Mm-hmm.
bent, but even though it may be after the fact,
Mm-hmm.
Pierce gets on the modernist bandwagon right around the Second World War.
Yeah, he does. Sandra Campbell explains this really well in her biography, that he has certain, brokers or intermediaries he starts to work with, like E.K. Brown, professor at the University of Toronto. And Brown starts to say to him, look, this modernism stuff isn't so bad. We can do some of this.
Yeah, because
Pierce
again,
open up.
you mentioned the influence of Roberts.
Yes.
He couldn't stand the modernists.
Right.
And his manifesto here, which you quote, is
Sincerity, simplicity, candor, music in phrase and cadence, beauty in thought and form, conscientious workmanship, and the modernism mistakes violence for strength, ugliness for originality.
Yes, right. Yeah, precisely. Yeah, that was really Pierce's line for a while. But, we have to keep in mind that ultimately a poet like Al Purdy publishes his first books in the Ryerson Poetry Chap-Books. So I really, what I'm trying to do in my research is to link up the origin of the series and its being anchored in the Confederation poets, on the one hand, with the contribution that it ultimately makes to modern contemporary Canadian literature in someone like Al Purdy at the end. And what fascinates me the most is that I think poetry remains this for a lot of us. It remains a discourse of idealism and beauty. Poetry shouldn't just be a difficult academic puzzle that you figure out in a university classroom. It should be uplifting. It should
appeal to the general public.
It should. That's right. And probably the best poets, don't lose sight of that, right? It's not just for the ivory tower.
It's not just to show off how smart you are.
No, exactly. It's supposed to move us. And that's what interests me about this series.
Well, that's what Pierce was getting at, too,
yeah.
I suppose. I mean, that's late romanticism, right?
Uh-huh. That's right. Yeah, exactly. And I think that, Pierce was a great reader. He loved literature. He loved English literature. He loved Russian literature. And what he loved about it was, sentiment, music, beauty, idealism. He did ultimately publish The Modernists, but, there was a reluctance there because he was hesitant to allow realism for its own sake. He would allow realism for an idealistic purpose, but just realism.
Well, again, that is to move the reader.
Yeah, to move the reader, to move the reader to be a better person than he or she might otherwise be.
You quote some I'm not sure exactly where it comes from, a reader response somewhere, but you quote readers saying the readers wanted lucid, morally inspiring verse that could be memorized, expressions of pleasurable or pleasure dignified, sentiment for rare moments of quiet, textual mirrors in which they could trace their own best potential selves, fresh inspiration that transports reader from the tiresome pressures of life.
Right, that starts to sound a bit like Archibald Lampman, doesn't it? So, yeah, you can see me absorbing it. But, poetry used to be published in the newspaper. Simple verses about memory, about love, about flowers. And I'm really interested in that function of it, in the average life.
Yeah.
Not just the professor's life, but the average person needed poetry too.
To lighten the load.
Yeah, exactly.
Or to put into words feelings of intense pain, suffering, or love.
That's right. And death too. I think we forget easily how present death was.
To make sense of it all.
That's right. Yeah, to be able to cope with, losing a sibling to polio or losing a parent to influenza. Rarer for us now.
You talk about the poems, need a bit of clarification on this one here. The poems, quote, demonstrate the marginality, the provisionality, and inversely,
The resolve of those who nevertheless attempt it reveal conditions in which Canadian literature was striving to take shape. What does that mean?
Okay, right. Well, most of the poems in this series are unknown. They've been totally forgotten and haven't been recuperated and curated by criticism.
Incidentally, I thought that first Roberts poem was very good.
Yeah.
I was very surprised. I thought that was going to get treacly, sentimental, religious.
Oh no, Roberts is a good poet. Roberts really was a good poet and deserves his place in our anthologies. Absolutely.
But you're saying most of it was ignored.
Well, a lot of it was ignored, but I think that what's interesting for me is that when you begin to understand the lives of the poets, you begin to appreciate their poetry. You know, the poetry starts.
You're supposed to separate those two, though.
Well, it starts to transform. The more you see that someone raised 8 children on a farm, and lost her husband, and kept writing poetry.
Yeah, but if the poetry sucks, then who cares?
No. I start to have respect for it. I start to be impressed that the person could produce. And I guess ultimately this becomes kind of social history or cultural studies. We're not just talking about the very best text ever put together. Mm-hmm. But Canadian literature will always be that. Canadian literature will always be interested in historical and political conditions of creation, because that's partly, the very term Canadian literature has this political adjective in it.
It's more than just the text.
It really is.
It's the environment.
Yeah, that's right.
Culture.
And I'm just attesting to my own experience. I would open up one of these chapbooks and think, oh, what's this? This is going to be not very worthwhile. I never heard of this guy. But often a lot of thought went into writing these texts, and there's more there than you first see. Mm-hmm. I do think we need to...
The life informs the work, then.
It does, yeah. And we also need to overcome our own reluctance and inertia with regard to poetry. Because when someone gives you a book of poetry, your first reaction is, this is going to be a lot of work.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Yes. I don't want to do this.
Right, I'm going to go watch TV instead.
Yeah, or surf the net, or social media, or whatever.
Yeah. But when you get over that hump, there's often something there of interest. Yeah. And I think actually what happened in the 20th century is that certain poets made sure that they were at the center of criticism and anthologization, and others were neglected. And we should, at this point...
That's what a lot of criticism is about, though, is shining a light on stuff that's been ignored.
Right. True. It is. But it also isn't perfectly disinterested, So
you're not perfectly disinterested?
I'm not perfectly disinterested, no.
What's your agenda here?
Well, I'm trying to add back in... The standard narrative is that Canadian poetry really moves to Montreal in the 20th century. And that's great. A.J.M. Smith, F.R. Scott, P.K. Page, they're great poets. Absolutely. They're fantastic poets.
A.M. Klein.
But there's a wider culture and reality of Canadian poetry in the 20th century. There are other voices.
That's sounding like someone who lives out in Saskatchewan. It's just too damn Montreal or Toronto centric.
Well, I grew up in Alberta, so there you go. Yeah.
There we have it. Yeah. Comes to light.
Yes.
I'm speaking to Eli MacLaren, who's a professor of English at McGill University in Montreal. Here's something else that you say. The aim of the project, the Chap-Books project, is to deepen and enrich existing concept of the evolution of Canadian literary publishing and of the diversity of Canadian literary history. So we've touched on this, the latter. What about the former there?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that there's more than meets the eye to publishing. Publishing happens in a variety of different ways. We tend naively to think of publishing as kind of a hitting of the big time. The editors are out there looking for talent, and true talent floats to the top, and good books are published, and authors become famous. But I think when you get into it, it's so much more complicated than that. You have You have small, basement presses essentially operating with a single individual's dedication. You have medium-sized presses getting government grants that would disappear if the government grant disappeared.
Yeah, and without them, these poets, writers, wouldn't get any kind of notoriety.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I was in Reading not that long ago at the publishing and printing archive there.
Okay.
Talking to the archivist guy, Baxter, and he said something quite similar. He said, what's interesting is the stuff that didn't happen or almost happened, could have happened, but didn't.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that I'm inspired by the same idea. What was the potential for literary creativity in Canada? I think it was huge. And then what was the reality? What actually got through the funnel
of what we talked about originally, England and the United States.
Yeah.
But was there anything else after that? These chapbooks sort of resulted. These poor little, tiny little things.
Yes.
This is the result of this. At least it's something, though.
Right. Yeah, it's something. I think we should keep in mind too that the way business works is there's leaders and followers. So the Americans get ahead in publishing and they don't give up that lead. They still have bigger markets, bigger scales of production, bigger advances to authors.
Yeah, they just have to lead. The press is running for an extra 10 minutes and they've covered the Canadian market.
Precisely, yeah, exactly. So that historical inequality runs through time in an interesting way. But, we need the small publishing circles to catch that talent. Alice Munro began in the small press in Canada. She published stories.
She began in the New Yorker is where she began.
Well, no, that was 1978, but she was writing stories from 1950.
And who was publishing her?
Well, her first stories are in a university magazine, and then she got married, had children. Western, I forget what it was called.
Okay.
And it's in Robert Thacker's biography. But then she was published by the Tamarack Review and editor Robert Weaver.
Big hero.
Yeah, definitely. So they didn't want to be a small press, but they essentially were a small press. And through that small publishing circle, eventually, she managed to hang in the authorship game until she got her big break with the New Yorker. And
there you go. See, I'm typical of not understanding the importance of this. But I just sort of bridled a bit when you said that these chapbooks are what facilitated the small press in Canada.
How did they do that?
Yeah.
Well, here's an example. David McKnight has a bibliographical history of the small press in Canada, and he goes back to the Ryerson Poetry Chapbooks, saying this is an early version of what then many other later publishers would do. And I think that a number of people got an experience of the small press through these chapbooks and then went off to found their own small presses.
Because they saw how cheaply they could do it?
Yeah, they saw how, yeah.
But chapbooks have been around since Henry VIII.
Oh, well, this is a really interesting thing. There's two senses of the word chapbook. There is Jack and the Beanstalk, the Ballad of the Folk, a cheap book printed and hawked across the English countryside by a peddler, by a chapman. There's that sort of folk culture of poetry, but there we're not talking about new poetry. We're talking about the oral ballads. Fables. Fables, things passed on through the oral tradition.
Right.
And it's not until the 1890s that starts to change towards the second definition of chapbook, which is a collection of original poetry by a novice poet.
And this was again through Stone and Kimball and the like?
Yeah, it was.
It's called the Chap. I've got some of them. They're very collectible. They're beautiful little things.
Right. Yeah, I think that little magazine was really influential in changing what the word chapbook meant. It kept the sense of collector's item. Because the old 18th century ballads were collector's items, and the new books by an unknown poet, they're collector's items too. But to come back to your first question, someone like Fred Cogswell, who founded Fiddlehead Books, he published in the Ryerson Poetry Chapbook series.
Did he?
Yeah.
Actually, so did J.E.H. MacDonald. He wrote some poems that got in.
Right, yeah.
Funny. And so, he really is accepting all sorts of people, right?
Yes, yeah. A.G. Bailey also was involved with the Fiddlehead. So I think it was kind of the trunk of a tree, then with lots of branches into the small press in different ways.
So you're saying that these poets saw this format and said to themselves, I can do that.
Yeah.
So why not?
Right.
It's funny, it would take that. You'd think that idea would come to them, before that. That's
Right. Well, that may well be. All I'm saying here is that the chapbooks were an important contributing model. I'm not saying that they were the sole source.
Okay. You're suggesting then that the kind of cheapness explains their longevity, you think? Because this is the longest series in the history of Canadian literature, right?
Yeah.
There's 200 of them.
Yeah, there's 200.
Between 25 and
1960. There's one in 1962 with kind of an outlier, seeing if it would still work after Pierce retired. But yeah, I think that Lorne Pierce found a formula that worked, which was, if they're cheap, then you can do them. And if they're going to cost money, then there's going to be all sorts of obstacles thrown up in your way. So yeah, and in that sense, that also points the way for many other later subsequent Canadian literary ventures. Don't spend much money and you can print whatever you want. I think that was Dennis Lee's idea when he founded House of Anansi Press. So yeah, I think that formula, that model, really starts to work. Also, I think that the Ryerson Poetry Chapbooks are important because the Canadian small press today is heavily subsidized. And I think what happened is that pioneering models such as Pierce's showed Canada, we can do this. So that the formula was there, and then the state invested in it, rather than.
But it wasn't that the private sector was thrilled with all the money they could make with this, because there wasn't much money to be made.
No, there wasn't. But the way to print these little books was evident, and it could be invested in. When finally the taps were turned on.
The government taps.
Yeah, the government taps with the Canada Council
in 1951. Or was it a bit later?
57.
I'm thinking of the Massey report.
Massey Commission.
That was 1951.
Right, precisely.
So Pierce failed to build a national literature through this initiative, or is it there and just not appreciated?
Okay, great question. Let's see. I'm conflicted here. In one way, I think he failed, but he created something that others could then succeed in. If we look at his support of Canadian authors, after he retires, Ryerson publishes Alice Munro, Dance of the Happy Shades.
Yeah.
GG
winner. Yeah.
Right. So that there's a pattern there that eventually bears big fruit. On the other hand, I do think we should go back to the Ryerson authors and read them, like Earl Burney's David, fantastic poem, or as I say, Al Purdy's early poetry, which I think is great. P.K. Page's first book.
It was one of the chapbooks.
Yeah, it wasn't a chapbook. No, it was a Ryerson.
It was a Ryerson book. Yeah. But yeah, it was his initiative.
It was, and literature is always a subjective matter of success and failure. It depends on your reading of the book if you think this is worthwhile or not. But I think it is. I think it's worthwhile. So I'm doing the academic hedging there. I want both and to that question.
Okay. So how should this neglected chapbook be incorporated in Canadian literary history?
Well, that's what I'm trying to do right now. I'm trying to tell the story of the publisher, the editor, and the poets. I can only do a few because there are too many. And
you focused on a couple, right?
Yeah, I focused on a couple in that article. I've got a chapter on Eugenie Perry, who's an unknown poet, but I think a pretty good poet at the end. Nathaniel Benson also was a lifelong poet, even though he had to do other things, teaching, advertising. And
where's he from?
He was from Toronto. Oh, sorry, I'm losing. What was the question again? I'm trying to read the poetry. I'm trying to read the poetry too, to say, look, this poetry is worth looking at twice.
It's not what I thought it was. It's not all sappy, sentimental crap.
No, it's not.
I mean, some of it is, I'm sure.
Yeah, some of it is. Yeah, but others is.
Do you want to edit? Why don't you just take them all and put them into a volume?
Yeah, I've thought about that. Maybe we'll do that too, or make a selection. People like selections.
Yeah.
But the first work is, for me, who were these authors? How did they publish what little they did? And,
so that's you're more sort of a
publishing
less
history.
of the text, more of the cultural environment.
Yeah, well, book history. Book history is the rubric that I kind of file myself under.
Okay.
Yeah.
So in other words, kind of reader response and
money that changed hands. What kind of authorship did people practice?
And the lives of the authors.
Yeah, that's right. Dealings with their editors.
Interaction between that and the text.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I think that was another question you wanted to answer, was how do these poets define poetry?
Right. Yes. Yeah, that's important to think about. I think it's important to get beyond just the single linear spectrum of good and bad poetry. It's important to understand that poetry was different things to different people.
Mm-hmm.
Some people wanted to enjoy it aloud with their family. Other people wanted it to tackle really difficult philosophical problems that they could study alone in silence. And we can see those different ideas of poetry in the poems themselves.
Yeah, because you make the point that they're not just all the same. There's quite a diversity within those 200.
There's a real variety.
Books.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, and I hope I can describe that properly in my study. We'll see.
Where are you at with the study?
I've written 3 chapters, and I want to write at least 2 more.
And it'll be a book then, will
Yeah,
it?
it'll be a
Is
monograph.
it already, is someone already committed to publish?
No, I don't have a contract yet. I mean, I'll look to some of the good Canadian academic presses and see if I can
convince them.
Yeah, I think they'll be convinced.
After this, they sure will.
Yes, right. Yeah.
Just one final question. I read somewhere that Leonard Cohen was in there. Is that true or not?
No, he didn't have a Ryerson poetry chapbook.
I couldn't see him being that. I don't know where I read that, but
Some other Montrealers were, though. Louis Dudek got into the series.
Okay. And Cohen was in Dudek's
circle,
but also didn't Dudek publish?
Yeah, I think so.
It was something from the McGill reading series or something.
Right.
So there is that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I should look though. There was a McGill chapbook, a McGill Ryerson poetry chapbook near the end of the series that had a variety of authors. And actually, I haven't checked if Cohen's there. Maybe he is.
I don't know. I read it. So
yeah.
I don't know if it's true or not.
That would be useful to find out.
Anything else you want to say about your study and what you want to achieve with it?
No, I think that's a pretty good cross section of what I'm thinking about, and I'm grateful for the chance to talk about it.
Well, I'm grateful for the chance to do so as well. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
I've been talking to Eli MacLaren, who teaches Canadian literature and the history of the book in the Department of English at McGill University in Montreal. Thanks again.